welcome to Swayam MOOC on British Poetry and Drama, 14th to 17th century. I'm Dr. Vandana Rajoriya and I'm very happy to be with you all again. Dear students, let's take a breath and think back. Over the last few sessions, we didn't just read John Donne, we entered his world, a world where love defies time, where God is not gently worshipped but violently summoned, and where saying goodbye is not sorrowful but deeply sacred. In Batter My Heart, the soul begs, but not for peace, but for holy invasion. In The Sun Rising, love mocks the sun itself. In A Valediction, it stretches like a compass, quiet, precise, eternal. Donne does not write from the surface of emotion. He writes from the depths of paradox. Clement Brooks once said that, poetry lies in paradoxes. And when you look at Donne's poetry, it actually, comes true. His love poems are debates. His prayers, demands, his metaphors, daring, disorienting, but unforgettable. Today, we take a step back, not to move away, but to look wider. We'll zoom in on this poet, to understand how he mixed violence with faith, mathematics with romance, logic with longing. What tradition gave rise to such a poetic mind? Today we'll explore that tradition. The one critics called, sometimes in awe, sometimes in disdain, metaphysical poetry. And at the heart of it lies something we call the metaphysical method. So before we actually start our discussions, let us look at the learning objectives of today's session. By the end of this lecture, you'll be able to define metaphysical poetry and explain what makes it unique. You'll be able to understand when, where, and how this style began. You'll be able to recognize the poetic tools it uses, especially wit, conceit, and philosophical arguments. You'll be able to appreciate how Donne and his fellow poets created poetry that thinks. And finally, you'll be able to explore why this complex, difficult, but astonishing poetry was once completely forgotten and then resurrected. Let us start our discussions with a discussion on the beginnings of metaphysical poetry. Now, when you think of beginnings of metaphysical poetry, here's something curious about it. The poets we now call metaphysical, Donne, Herbert, Marvell, they never used that label. In fact, it was invented much later. In 1777, by a man who didn't like them much, Samuel Johnson, the great poet, 18th century critic. So, while writing his famous piece, The Life of Cowley, he said that these are the most heterogeneous ideas yoked by violence together. Remember, not by elegance, not by harmony, but violence. What did he mean? He meant that these poets jammed together lust and logic, sacred and the profane, all in the same breath. He accused them of flaunting their learning by using far-fetched comparisons and most damningly of lacking genuine feeling. But Johnson wasn't alone in his dislike. John Dryden had already grumbled that Donne was affecting the metaphysics, perplexing the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy. Even as early as the 1630s, William Drummond likely had done in mind when, he scoffed at poetry filled with metaphysical ideas and scholastical quiddities. So, what exactly were they all protesting? This, the metaphysical poets basically rejected the polished, courtly sweetness of Elizabethan verse. You saw it in Sidney and Spencer. Instead, they gave us muscular rhythms, tough, tangled thoughts, and metaphors that leap across theology, anatomy, astronomy, alchemy, law, and even mathematics. This loosely connected group of poets, Donne, Herbert, Marvell, Crashaw, Cleveland, all of them shared a fierce intellect, a startling originality, and a love for argument and paradox. They used conceits, extended metaphors drawn from philosophy, religion, science to twist familiar feelings into new shapes. Donne, above all, reached beyond the ordered world of the 17th century. His mind was restless, daring, exploratory, and it helped him in inventing something very bold, brainy, utterly new, and the world will know it as metaphysical poetry. Now that we have understood metaphysical poetry, let us look at the historical context. Why metaphysical poetry arose when it did? How metaphysical poetry came into being? To really understand metaphysical poetry, we need to understand why it happened. Why did poets like John Donne suddenly start writing this way? Bold, brainy, full of strange metaphors and sharp arguments? The answer lies in the moment. We are in early 1600s England, a world on edge when you are looking at him. Just a few decades earlier, the Renaissance had filled Europe with light, classical ideas, beauty, balance, harmony. Poets like Shakespeare, Spencer, Sidney, all of them wrote with elegance and order. But the world back then still felt, meaningful. But when Donne and his friends start writing, the world is cracking. Reformation has torn apart the church. One faith has now become many. Certainty has, turned into confusion. People are no longer sure of, what to believe, whom to trust, whether to believe in God or not. And this whole world of science, latest scientific inventions and discoveries. Telescope has been invented and shows that Earth is in the center of the universe, shaking their whole faith. Microscope reveals that the body isn't sacred, it is made of tiny parts. Suddenly, the cosmos feels endless, and human beings, they start feeling so small. People start asking deep, difficult questions, questions like, what is the soul? Can love survive time and distance? Where is God now? In heaven or inside us? What does it even mean to be human, anymore? This is the storm that gave birth to metaphysical poetry. A poetry that couldn't just be pretty or musical anymore. It had to think, it had to argue, it had to go deep, and that's exactly what Donne did. He didn't write to please, he wrote to provoke. He took love and made it cosmic. He took faith and made it physical. He pulled in ideas from science, law, medicine, alchemy, and turned them all into verse that feels like a wrestling match between mind and soul. If it was not done by Donne, Donne's poetry would not have been honest to him and his time. And Donne's poetry, you find it was very honest, restless, raw, just like his age. It was poetry for a world which was full of so many questions, and it's here why it still matters, We are still in that world, a world of doubt, overload and contradictions. We too want answers, We too are torn between faith and reason, body and mind, love and logic. And this is the reason why metaphysical poetry, it grabs us so powerfully today. And that's why metaphysical poetry still grabs us, because it doesn't hide from the hard stuff. It thinks and makes us think. Now that we have talked at length about metaphysical poetry, let us take a moment and dive deeper to take a closer look at these metaphysical poets, and also how they made poetry work. So, who were these poets, whom we always refer to as metaphysical poets? Obviously, when we begin our discussions of metaphysical poets, undeniably, John Donne is the center of it all. So, he wrote somewhere, between 1572 to 1631. John Donne, he was bold, complex, but deeply personal. Donne didn't start a movement, but his voice was so powerful that others automatically followed his lead. Let's meet the key voices, key figures who joined John Donne in this movement, in this fascinating poetic circle. So, first one was, apart from Donne, George Herbert. He was, if Donne was the rebel, Herbert was the reverend craftsman. His poems like The Altar and Easter Wings, they combine deep faith and clever poetic form. Language is simple, but it is rich, rich with spiritual meaning. Think of Herbert as a poet who makes prayer feel intellectual. Then comes Richard Crashaw. He was a convert to Catholicism. Crashaw's poetry is therefore intense, it is mystical, it is sensory. His verses are filled with candles, blood, incense and divine passion. If Herbert whispers, Crashaw sings and burns. Then we have Henry Vaughan. Henry Vaughan as a poet brings nature into the metaphysical, world of poetry. He was inspired by Herbert. He mixed Christian mysticism with the beauty of natural world. So, when you read Vaughan, his poetry feels like entering into a sacred forest at sunrise, still, calm and glowing with meaning. Then the next poet is Andrew Marvell. Marvell was very witty. You can understand him as an intellectual flirt. His very famous poem to his coy mistress, in this he mixes logic, time and desire and creates something magical. These lines are also lines which are my favorite. Whenever we are rushing, we do not have to tell my students, if we had but enough world and time. And whenever my students, they start getting impatient, I tell them, we have but enough world and time. So, let us look at a few lines of the poem to understand it. Had we but enough world and time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side shouldest rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. He blends philosophy with persuasion. seriousness with seduction. He's a poet of paradox, with playful urgency. Then we have Thomas Traherne. He is less famous, but he's full of wonder. Traherne writes about innocence, joy, and eternity, like a child discovering the divine. Think of him as the metaphysical poet of spiritual happiness. Abraham Cowley comes later, but he's more polished and classical, He keeps metaphysical spirit alive with his clever arguments, elegant phrasing. So central was he that Samuel Johnson's famous critique was titled The Life of Cowley, and the term metaphysical poets, it comes from that. Then you had Lord Herbert of Shewbury. He was not just a poet, but a poet-philosopher. He blends faith and reason, representing a shift from devotion to rational spirituality. His poetry thinks deeply about, human belief systems. Then you had some minor metaphysical poets who wrote not much, but they followed. So you had Edward Benlowes, you had Henry King, John Cleveland, William Drummond. All of them expressed, grief, politics, philosophy through the same metaphysical lens, They weren't minor in thought, just lesser known. So what unites them all? No manifesto, no club, no school, no single religion. What brings them together is how they write, their style, their way of thinking. They do poetry that argues as much as it sings. Poetry that uses metaphor, paradox and intellect. Poetry that explores faith, love, death and the soul with courage and complexity. This is what makes them metaphysical. And as we return to Donne, remember, he wasn't alone. He was the spark in a whole constellation of minds. Now that we have looked at all the great metaphysical poets, let us look more closely at the stylistic traits of metaphysical poetry, to understand, what really makes these poems metaphysical. It is not just the time period or even the religion. It is the method, the poetic fingerprint that runs across Donne, Herbert, Marvell and all others. So let us try to understand it. Very first thing which you would find in every poem which qualifies to be called metaphysical poetry is conceit. You can understand conceit as a far-fetched metaphor. Not just a clever metaphor, clever comparison, but one which is bizarre. Comparison stretches across the entire poem. You remember Donne's compass in A Valediction Forbidding Mourning? Or, even the sun being scolded by lovers in the sun rising? That's a conceit. Taking a small idea and spinning it through something cosmic. Second quality is their wit. Yes, wit here is not in joke telling. It is in the deep sarcasm, but it is in verbal ingenuity. The kind that surprises, it delights you even when it challenges you. It's where your intellect becomes your style. Feel the thinking mind of Donne, working on page, like a wrestling argument match. Then after conceit and wit, third quality which you find in metaphysical poetry is its argument and paradox. Almost all of these poems, they aren't just expressive, they are very deeply logical. Donne doesn't describe love or even God. He builds a case like a lawyer. He says things that seem contradictory and then shows us that they are not. He says, except you enthrall me, never shall I be free. Or are two souls therefore which are one. That's classic metaphysical tension. The emotional drama wrapped in philosophical debate. Next comes its imagery. Instead of like in normal poem, normal poetry, love poetry, you find flowers, hunters, nature. But instead of flowers, and stars, what is it that you get in these poems? You get astronomy, alchemy, medicine, law, theology. Dance poems are like cabinet drawers filled with telescopes, scriptures, compasses, courtroom arguments. Another feature of metaphysical poetry is that, it has a speaking voice. It is not distant or ornamental. It is very intimate, urgent, like someone whispering in your ear or pleading in court. Finally, rhythm. Metaphysical poets do not care for perfect melody or even sing-song meter. Their lines are rugged, they are irregular, almost like speech at times, because their goal was not to create musical beauty, but to create a cognitive pressure. They wanted you to think as much as you feel. So conceit, wit, paradox, argument, philosophical imagery, speaking voice, rough rhythm, all these, they are building blocks of metaphysical methods. So when you find all of them in a poem, know for sure that you can call it safely metaphysical poetry. It is very strange, like so many brilliant things which humanity has lost. There was a time when even metaphysical poetry was lost. It had its moment, then it faded. By late 1600s, the literary taste of England changed completely. Restoration brought a love for clarity, balance and symmetry. You can find it in Dryden, you can find it in Pope. Their poetry was smooth. It was measured, polished, designed to both instruct as well as delight. In this world, metaphysical poets sounded, very messy, too intellectual, raw, what Johnson called them fantastical combinations. So they were pushed aside. They were forgotten, as old-fashioned curiosities. People thought they were very quaint, clever, irrelevant. For almost 200 years, Donne and his friends, they were all largely forgotten. But in 20th century, comes a man, we've talked about him, T.S. Eliot, and with him comes a revolution. In 1921, literary scholar H.J.C. Grayson published a landmark anthology, Metaphysical Lyrics and Poems of the 17th Century. This anthology caught attention of, none other than T.S. Eliot, and he wrote a very famous essay mesmerized by the power of their poetry. The title was The Metaphysical Poets. Eliot made bold claim. He said Donne and his peers weren't outdated. They were visionaries of the modern mind. He praised their unified sensibility, a rare power to think and feel as one. He said, for Donne, a metaphor wasn't just decoration, it was a thought in motion. It modified his sensibility. So it was emotion, in the form of an argument. Eliot believed that modern poetry needed this, in a world which was shattered by war. Remember the two wars, world wars, noise, disconnection. Eliot found a unique power to voice his feelings in these metaphysical poets. And he wasn't alone, Ezra Pound, W.B. Yeats, all of them. They looked at these metaphysical poets for inspiration. Their poetry was brief but bold, philosophical but passionate, more provocation than consolation. They didn't soothe, they startled, and just like that, the metaphysical poets were back, because this is what this age needed the most, So, metaphysical poets returned not as museum pieces but as masters of intensity. With this, we come to an end of our discussions of metaphysical poetry, from its dismissal to its rediscovery, from Johnson to Eliot. We return now to Donne, this time with new eyes. Let's revisit the poems we have read and ask, how does Donne use wit, conceit and argument, not just to impress but to unsettle? Because this is where, this is what is crucial to our understanding of Donne's poem. So, let us see metaphysical method in action. Let us explore Donne's wit, conceit and philosophical arguments from close, We have traced the journey of metaphysical poetry, its rejection, revival. Now prepare yourself to see the method at work. Why? Because there is no better guide than Donne to understand it. Because his poetry didn't just express ideas, it wrestled with them. We'll try to revisit, 3 of his poems, we have studied already. Batter My Heart, Sun Rising and A Valediction Forbidding Morning. We'll try to explore these 3 pillars of metaphysical poetry, wit, conceit and philosophical argument, through these poems as lenses. So, let us start with wit. What is wit? Verbal spark and surprising insight. Wit in Donne isn't just clever wordplay, it is mental electricity. It shocks, flips and surprises. In Batter My Heart, he asks God not to comfort but to break him. What does he say? Break, blow, burn and make me new. The soul is a fortress under siege by sin. Donne twists the metaphor. Salvation needs violent grace, not comfort. That's wit, turning devotion into contradiction. In The Sun Rising, he calls the sun busy old fool, mocking time itself. He's so angry at his own mortality and sun's immortality. Why? Because, love, he claims, makes universe irrelevant. What does he say? She's all states and all princes I. Witty, isn't it? Absurd, but, so persuasive. This is Donne's wit. In A Valediction Forbidding Morning, wit becomes calm brilliance. No weeping farewells, just geometry. What does he say? Our 2 souls, which are therefore one, endure not yet a breach but an expansion. Their love is like gold, like a compass, stretching but never breaking. In Donne, wit becomes elegant inside. Now, let us look at the conceit at work in his poems. Conceit is extended metaphor as structure. So, if wit is the flesh, conceit is the frame. Donne's conceits carry the entire poem. In Batter My Heart, the soul is a city under siege. Speaker must be ravished by God to be free. And therefore he says, you remember the lines, except you enthrall me, never shall be free. One conceit, many identities, sinner, lover, soldier. In Sun Rising, the conceit flips reality, alters reality. So their bedroom becomes the center of the universe. So when he says she's all saints, nothing else is, the word doesn't shape their love shapes the world. Interesting, isn't it? Then in A Valediction Forbidding Morning, compass conceit is iconic, unforgettable. 2 souls like compass legs, one still, one moving but always joined. It is not just poetic, it's architectural. Donne builds whole arguments around a single sustained metaphor. So in Batter My Heart, Donne pleads through paradoxes. I must be broken to be healed. I must be bound to be free. He argues his way into surrender, each line like a courtroom logic. Sunrising, he challenges, mocks and out-reasons it. Love all alike, no season knows. Love isn't ruled by time, it rules time. In Valediction, he makes a very careful case. True love doesn't depend on presence, it stretches, it endures like gold to airy thinness bead. The tone is logical, poetic, but very powerful. These examples, I am sure you would have understood the metaphysical method, because you have seen it at work. So, wit, which is not just cleverness, but a revelation. Conceit, which is not just a metaphor, but a structure. Argument, which is not just emotion, but reasoning. Donne's poem don't whisper, they grip you. They ask you to think and feel at the same time. That is metaphysical method, and that is what makes Donne not just memorable but unforgettable. As we end today's lecture, let us step back, not just from Donne but from everything the metaphysical poets left behind. What started as a rebellion against smooth, courtly verse of Sidney Spencer and all became a model for modern poetic thought. Metaphysical method wasn't just a style, it was a way of thinking. Tension and tenderness hand in hand. It was like argument and emotion, wit and wonder, all in one breath. Donne's influence on modern poetry was absolute. If you look at 20th century, when T.S. Eliot said metaphysicals had what modern poets lost, a unified sensibility where thought and feeling weren't divided but fused, he's highlighting something very important. In Donne, a heartbeat sparks theology, a goodbye becomes geometry, a prayer sounds like a love cry. That's what Eliot admired, what Yeats, Pound, Heine echoed, all of them wrote in that line, and what still stirs readers today. Therefore, Donne's legacy continues even today. You can find it in dense, reflective lines of Adrienne Rich and Geoffrey Hill, in the spiritual struggles of Seamus Heaney, in the cosmic metaphors of Margaret Atwood, even in spoken word, where love meets physics and protest meet poetry. Wherever poetry dares to think, feel at once, Donne's spirit lives on. So with this we come to an end of our discussions today. As we move forward, carry this not just admiration for Donne, but inspiration. Next time we leave poetry behind and step into the dramatic world of Renaissance stage to meet two towering voices of English theatre. Till then, keep reading and stay curious. Thank you.